Finch, it's great to have you back on the road to autonomy. We're headed into election season now. We've got a rematch of the election, President Trump against President Biden. A lot of policy implications. What should companies be aware of from a policy perspective that are developing automation today?
I think that you can't get aside the prioritization that this administration's put on being the most pro-union administration of all time. This is interesting. We've seen this play out in a number of ways when it comes to the rulemakings, but you may have seen the recent polls that while President Biden seems to have captured organized labor's leadership, we see many rank and file organized labor members or blue-collar workers or normal people. The majority of them support President Trump. So we're seeing an ongoing fight among the two candidates to try and win this membership. So we're going to be watching what this can mean in terms of the promises both campaigns make to organized labor. For automation, we're thinking specifically about the Teamsters and how that plays out. So we've got the impacts of organized labor demands on the current administration, but also the impacts of how they're going to shape the campaigns among each of the candidates. I think you can't understate the importance of organized labor and their demands today.
We're going to throw it out there. Big data, Bank of America published the data today. Hybrid sales are outpacing electric vehicle sales. The market for electric vehicles is floundering. And then you got the Elon Musk issue. Tesla single-handedly built the electric vehicle industry in America, but yet they're not welcome at the White House. Elon now controls X, very powerful platform. Despite it's been reported, you look at the data, it's growing. The algorithm's getting better. Tesla's now changed their marketing around full self-driving. Elon has hinted that he'll put his weight behind President Trump. Could that potentially swing an election? Is this the new Oprah effect?
I don't know about that. That's funny though. I mean, look, we've seen Elon Musk is going to be a powerful voice that people listen to. He seems to have stopped short of saying, I think he said he's not going to endorse either candidate, but certainly he shows indications of support for either side. You know, he did change the world for electric vehicles. And there's an argument to be made that really centers on him. You know, in a right-of-center government, you tend to have pull effects. The government wants to make sure that the flow of commerce goes, that people can make the choices they want, but the federal government's role is to support basic research and remove any unnecessary barriers to innovation. So we saw electric vehicles skyrocket, you know, mainly thinking about Teslas, under President Trump and then President Biden. With Democrats, you tend to have a push effect, right? So this is where we see the incentives. This is where we see the big bipartisan infrastructure law, the CHIPS Act, all of these efforts, including the rulemaking from EPA and NHTSA with CAFE on fuel efficiency. The rulemakings themselves call them technology forcing mandates. And so we're looking at the push effect of trying to say, we want to push these technologies to the people. And so what we're seeing is a different approach towards electrification. Democrats want to push this forward so that people and lower the barriers for people to take it in, while Republicans tend to sort of pull it along and say, if people want this, we want to make sure people can choose this. And so we see this play out in different ways. And we see the one risk that you run into with a push effect is that if people aren't ready for it and aren't willing for it yet, and they're not choosing it, then you run into all sorts of unintended consequences. And so, you know, I've heard others say that the right pace for electric vehicle adoption is don't move too fast, but also don't move too slow. That's what the automotive companies are saying. So there is a balance. And we've seen certainly a right-of-center government is looking at how do we make sure people have the choices and the types of technologies they choose and adopt. I think that's why we land on hybrids, because you get sort of the best of both worlds. I'd like to be able to charge my vehicle at home without having to go to the gas station, but I also want to be able to drive my car over 100 miles or 200 or 300, depending on the vehicle and the range. But I should get that choice. And so looking at this and looking at how this plays out with the government's approach by what, you know, Republicans have put out in their policy documents about how they'd like this to play out, and by how Democrats are looking at their blueprint for decarbonization, carrying forward these through 2030 and beyond, how they would look at pushing the adoption of electric vehicles, it really shows the differences in the approach to government and the role of the federal government.
You can't force an American to buy something. We saw that with healthcare, right? We all remember that. Supreme Court ruled it out. It's illegal. It's unconstitutional. You mentioned the CHIPS Act. So Intel, they recently reported a $7 billion loss in the foundry business, which is supported with our taxpayer dollars. You have an issue there. And on the backside of that, you got the Taiwan issue, around chips. That all started with Morris Chang from Texas Instruments. The Taiwanese government gave them incentives to go there and build, and look what happened. And so we didn't prepare for that in that whole thing coming. And then with electric vehicles, 90+% of the materials that go into electric vehicles are China. Why do we never look at securing a supply chain before we make a major policy change?
You know what was interesting? So DOD recently did a study that started in 2019. It was a 5-year study, cost $400 million to try and look at the different components and the sourcing of them in some of our major weapon systems. This is a Forbes article that came out recently about it. I can send you. It's super interesting, but incredibly complex, dramatically interwoven. We couldn't today just decide to separate our weapons supply chains for our military from China. There are some components that right now we can only get it from China, and I'm not sure we knew that before this report came out. So what we're looking at is, even in the military, very top-down, command and control, everybody is given plenty of money to think through the national implications of their choices. And you're talking about Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon putting together these systems, and they can't separate themselves from the supply chain of foreign adversaries, namely China. And so if the DoD has this much trouble doing it, and we look at the global supply chain for vehicles and vehicle equipments, and we can't de-aggregate it and separate it entirely, we have to think about how we can approach things differently, right? So you're right. You start out and you dump a lot of money into things, and then you don't think through sourcing on the front end. It can be problematic. Now, I will say, I was just at the SAFE Summit, which brought in a lot of the people doing the investment state by state. And there was a lot of the ongoing attitude is that this money is good and it's helping onshore some of the domestic manufacturing capabilities. And the fact that the money is flowing to the places where people are the most business friendly, which turns out to be a lot of these Republican run states. And so they tend to have Republican members of Congress. So it sounds like the thought coming out of this is that these investments are here to stay, that more money will flow into this, and that we will continue this sort of domestic onshoring that ultimately is very good for America in the long run. But certainly we're going to have to work through some of these short and medium term implications of taking these actions.
States that are pro-business are creating jobs. The largest employer in the great state of Texas now is Tesla. Over 22,000 individuals in the great state of Texas are employed by Tesla. Those jobs could have been in California, but the regulatory and the business and climate environment said, Texas is benefiting. I look at history, and I'm going to ask this. Is history about to repeat itself again for a negative way? Chips, we lost control of the supply chain to Taiwan and China. Electric vehicles, lost control of supply chain to China and Australia. Is the same thing going to happen with autonomy if we do not get the policy right?
It very well could. I don't know if you followed sort of the history progression of the adoption of technology in transportation as a whole. By far, the most advanced, wide-ranging technology that changed the world as we know it was the standardization of the box, right? The container that goes on the ships, that goes on the backs of trucks, that goes on rail cars, that fundamentally changed the world. And it did so by changing the way we move goods. We weren't moving things by break bulk anymore. And then once we started adopting the standardized crate, we started seeing ports investing in the advanced technology to bring the boxes from the ship to the shore and changing the nature of the longshoreman jobs, right? They were started out with these jobs that are just backbreaking, just terrible, difficult. They had some of the highest injury rates. They didn't have access to a, routine daily pay. It was boom or bust. They changed the fundamental nature of those jobs. And ultimately what we saw is the ports that adopted the automation technology more quickly, they had more business flow to them. The jobs changed themselves. And what we saw is the ports of New York and New Jersey opposed the modernization of the ports and that technology. The ports of LA and Long Beach adopted it. And ultimately, the unionized workforces in LA and Long Beach started advocating for the quicker adoption of these technologies because it improved the quality of life, the pay, the types of jobs they held. It changed the fundamental nature of their jobs for better. And so this technology worked for them. So what we can see is that happening today, except today in California, you've got the Teamsters and others opposing autonomous trucking technology. right? And so if they block that, this technology that could represent a 40% reduction in the cost of moving goods, the flow of commerce will shift, right? We saw it during the pandemic with commerce with the port of LA and Long Beach, the line being miles long to get in, commerce flowed to different ports in the US. So as we saw the Gulf Coast ports take this freight, we can see that again. The entire reason ports like Shanghai, Singapore, the entire reason Dubai exists as we know it today is because they changed their ports to adopt this technology and to make it easier to move the flow of goods. And so suddenly these ports existed in places that were fishing towns for decades and decades and decades. And they started adopting this technology in the 70s. And look at them today. I mean, the existence of places like Singapore and Dubai because of the adoption of this technology. What I worry about is LA and Long Beach will block things like autonomous trucking, and the flow of commerce will continue to go downhill, and that means the goods will go elsewhere. Now, it may mean the port of Savannah or Houston or elsewhere, but it may not be US. And so what we know is when you lower the cost of goods, you get more of it, the flows will go somewhere, and then all the just-in-time manufacturing jobs that come with it, all the warehousing jobs, all the other jobs that come out of the flow of commerce, they'll just go elsewhere. And we'll lose all of the jobs because we decided to try and hold barriers in place that would keep costs higher than they have to be, creating a dam, and the water will go around the dam, the flow of commerce will go around it and go elsewhere. I mean, it's a real cost, and those that are gambling to try and protect their jobs, which doesn't make sense because autonomous truckings have been shown not to impact any of today's drivers and to give tomorrow's truck drivers different choices on the types of jobs they can take. They're not even gambling with their jobs. They're gambling with the other jobs. They're gambling with the manufacturing jobs, with the warehousing jobs, with all of the other jobs that the flow of commerce can bring. All for what? It doesn't make any sense to me, and I think it could be dramatically problematic for the U.S.
They're gambling with the U.S. economy, point blank. Is organized labor regulating themselves out of business?
They could be. I mean, look, organized labor, the Teamsters in particular, I should say, did best when they were working alongside business to grow the share of pie for trucking, right? Goods don't have to move by truck. We've seen the fight with rail for decades. We actually saw rail unable to remove their own regulations and lose business to trucking, back going into the 70s. Once we saw deregulation as a whole, we saw the flow of commerce increase all around. I think we've seen a reduction of 1/6 of the total cost of shipping goods since the 70s. That's a dramatic impact. That's 3% of the entire economy today is based off of the additional flows because we've reduced the regulations and allow commerce to flow more freely, like water downhill. Yeah, I saw one study that showed that the U.S. imported 4 times as many variety of goods in 2002 as in 1972 because we made it easier for the flow of commerce to go. Now, take that and look at the impacts to your average American. Think through cooking in the 1950s and the 1960s. Doesn't really have that great of a reputation. But then start looking at the 70s, 80s, 90s, today. So I want you to think about what you see on Top Chef, which I binged heavily during the pandemic. Compare that to the French Chef and all the Julia Terrell's cooking. Consumers have so many more choices on the types of goods they can take in because we've removed barriers to shipping things around the world. We're giving American goods more choices, American consumers more choices in the goods they can consume, but American innovators more tools in the things they can bring together. More the just-in-time manufacturing. We lower the cost for them to combine different components to create new chemicals, new pharmaceuticals, new robotics, new tools. If we push those elsewhere, those innovations will go elsewhere, and the American innovators won't have access to the same number of inputs as others around the world. It's problematic.
It's sad. It just seems like it's driven by corporate greed without any real strategy. You have the Teamsters are pushing driver-in bills, and you ask them why they say safety, 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 and you had Waymo put out a report from Swiss Re, and they're publicly audited, by the way, so you can't just put out a press release. And you have all the safety stuff around autonomous trucking, but yet they say safety, 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 and then when you try and have a conversation around the facts, they don't even want to have the conversation around the facts. When does the narrative change that this is good for the economy And if autonomous trucking does not happen, the American economy is going to suffer. And if the American economy suffers, guess what happens? Inflation goes up. Inflation goes up, interest rates go up. Your credit card payment goes up. Your mortgages go up. Then what happens? The consumer
makes it
gets
harder
squeezed.
to raise venture capital funds and to get investments, which means your startup goes out of business and you got to become a lobbyist. It's not pretty.
You're a lobbyist. You worked in.
That's what I'm saying.
That's
what happened to me.
Yeah, well, you're doing pretty good. You worked in the Trump administration. Perhaps you'll work in the second Trump administration. Hypothetically, how would the second Trump administration approach China as it relates to BYD, Xiaomi, potentially using the NAFTA loophole, bringing in electric vehicles into America, and also bringing in autonomous vehicles into America? And I have to highlight this. BYD now has their version of a FSD. And you can't make this up. It's called Navigate on Autopilot. You follow this whole trend of copying. They're copying in.
So obviously, President Trump is very strong against China. He highlighted again and again that the Chinese have stolen trade secrets. They've stolen our technology. They've stolen the inputs that our innovators put together, and they've sought to commercialize it. So he took a number of steps to block that. And what's interesting is many of President Biden's steps have built on and embraced the approach of President Trump. I think Trump did some of the hard things that Biden could grow on quietly. So I think that some of it will be consistent. We've seen on the right and the left the understanding that China has been, frankly, stealing from us, robbing us blind. These aren't things that I'm saying myself. There's been a number of congressional hearings with witnesses from our own intelligence systems that have been saying that. I mean, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars in IP a year that have just been taken from us and given to Chinese state-run enterprises to compete with our people. So it's problematic. I think you'll continue to see an emphasis and a focus on Chinese technologies and bringing them into America. I think you'll see a lot of the loopholes addressed and more of the issues. I mean, just broadly, it's going to be addressed, I think, if you have right or the left. But what it does give me some heart to know that President Biden has kept many of President Trump's initiatives and executive orders.
That's refreshing. I'm just worried that we are going to fall behind on the development of autonomous vehicles, the commercialization of autonomous vehicles, and because of the legislations happening in the state houses. And the next thing I'm really worried about is the development of AI. How do we ensure that we stay ahead on autonomy and how we stay ahead on AI?
I think it does make sense to have a risk-based approach, but to make sure that as you have these different approaches with trying to help people understand and address different types of AI systems, that you don't have a one-size-fits-all approach. You can handle things differently depending on the impacts of that AI system. Now, I don't agree with the general European approach of regulate, then subsidize. One of the issues they have is that they don't have many of the innovators that are creating this technology. So they're thinking it's somebody else. It's an American company bringing their technology in here. So we want to stop that until we can understand it. But those efforts to stop this technology and to stop these innovations until we can understand it are hindering their own innovations. And so regulate and subsidize doesn't work. As we look at AI systems, I know Kai-Fu Lee put out his book. It's been 5, 6, 7 years now, but he talked about why he thought China would win in AI, the development of AI systems. One is they have the raw manpower. They can just throw people at this, educated people that can just try and mash through these systems and make the advances in the systems. 2 is they have the whole of government backing on their efforts. You know, there is one mind in the government and it is directing them to lead in this technology. And 3, Chinese privacy is a joke. There is no personal information. It's the government's information that just happens to be generated from the individuals. So there's no protection on privacy. Your data is their data. And so they have so much more they can train their systems on. But we don't beat China by trying to out-China them, right? We have to beat them the American way. We'll do it our way. We'll make sure there's a fair playing field. We'll allow our innovators to innovate. We'll make sure that safety is in place, but we're not going to go crazy trying to regulate before we understand the impacts of the technology. We have to work side by side to make sure that no one is unfairly impacted. And we have to make sure that we don't jump ahead of ourselves and in theorizing about what the potential risks to be and start going after those things that may not be in any way connected to reality. We can beat China. We've beaten them before. We can continue to beat them in the future, but we have to do it the American way.
The American way is built. No other way around it. We build, we build, we build. If you remove America from the global economy, there is no economy. You can sit here and make an argument about China, but there is no economy. That economy was built on copycatting. The American economy was built on ingenuity, sweat, and hard work, and that's only going to continue. That's these really smart men and women that are building autonomous technology today. They're really, really smart. They believe in this. They want America to win. The one thing that I'm extremely proud of lately, which is a beautiful trend, it is an absolute beautiful trend, is Silicon Valley companies are starting to embrace the DoD finally and putting their ingenuity into building applications for defense. Where did this change of heart come from, where tech is now leaning in to DoD and wanting to be a part of the American effort to build greatness?
I think that it's a misnomer to say it's new. Silicon Valley was founded off the backs of DoD funding. There's actually, if you live in DC, you'll see one of the Smithsonian's has an exhibit that's, of course, free. And like me, you can take your daughters to, which I'm sure they love. But it goes to the history of Silicon Valley and its joint effort with DoD funding, getting research funds from the DoD. A lot of the basic research that the federal government provides that can help support our military is dual-use technology that can support our economy. So there's a long history. I think with Silicon Valley, it may go back to the 50s, I think, when the first major contracts went there and we started growing. But the leadership, some Silicon Valley leaders like to separate themselves from that history because they find it distasteful. But there's a lot that the U.S. government has done on the basic research side of things that have supported all of the applied research and the tech transfer side of technology and growth in the U.S. I mean, there is a role for the federal government in basic research, in researching things that there's not an immediate impact for commercialization. So that's where we saw the internet coming from DoD. It's where we saw autonomous vehicles with the DARPA challenge and all of the Stanford and Carnegie Mellon and the other academic schools or whatever universities that participated in it. A lot of this is not new. And so understanding that and being able to take advantage of that, I mean, it can keep companies afloat while commercialization continues. I think it's a real important path for the future of our technologies.
There's an argument that can be made without the DARPA grand challenges and the urban challenge, autonomous vehicles wouldn't be advanced as they are today. Obviously, we know without DoD funding, Fairchild Wheeler wouldn't be here. Intel wouldn't be here. The internet wouldn't be here. We can go down the line. We wouldn't have the breakthroughs on radar technology that all came out of DoD funding. Chip technology, DoD funding, just going down the line. If on January 20th, 2025 at 12:01, if there's a change in administration, what happens to both autonomous vehicle policy and autonomous truck policy?
Well, I know that if President Trump wins, the policies that have been written in the mandate for leadership talk about finishing the NHTSA and the FMCSA rulemakings so that there is a path towards commercialization. Because right now, what we've seen is there hasn't been a lot of progress in the first 3 years on these rulemakings. There's been sidesteps, there's been more questions asked, but without that clarity of what does the future mean? I mean, these companies can reach whatever bar for safety you're raising so we can make sure it makes sense, but they need that clarity and the certainty so they can make the investments, they can flow through. I mean, what we're seeing is we ought to see some of the first steps towards commercialization on road by the end of the year this year, if some of the major companies we're talking about can hit their goals. And so that will be big for introduction, but you really can't go all that far until we finish some of the rulemaking steps that FMCSA in particular have to finish. There is no path for commercialization unless those steps are taken. So the FMCSA has to continue. The industry needs them to continue moving these steps forward. The petition for warning indicators, that has to move forward, right? You have to have a way to be able to indicate to anybody that a vehicle is pulled over on the side of the road. And this impacts all road users. I mean, today, the idea that a truck driver driving a conventionally driven truck, if somebody else hits them, which is usually the case, in 75% of the cases, the trained professional truck driver is not causing any sort of crash or accident. It's the idiots like you and me that are on the road that aren't nearly as good as the professional truck drivers. So if somebody hits a truck, it has to pull over on the side of the road and put out warning markers. So you have this poor truck driver that's got to get out on the interstate or a major highway, walk 40 paces behind the vehicle, drop a fuse or warning marker, and then walk back to their truck and hope no one hits them. And then at the end, when the truck's ready to go again, they got to walk back out there again, putting their lives at risk to go get this warning marker or the fuse, clean up after themselves, put it back on the truck. That's bonkers. You should be able to have alternative means of compliance. Put up big conspicuous lights on the truck to let people know. And why don't we just have a way that they can alert the Waze apps and the Google Maps and the Apple Maps, common data specifications, so they can raise a flag and people can see on the map that there's a truck pullover on the side of the road coming up around the corner. I mean, this is common sense. This improves safety. And that's all we're looking, just something that can improve safety for all truck drivers, but that happens to have a big impact for autonomous trucks. I mean, talk about common sense. That makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense. The Waze integration, the Google Maps integration, the Apple Maps integration makes a ton of sense. Would an FMCSA under President Trump look to integrate that and put an innovative solution that is highly scalable and also extremely cost effective and increasing safety?
So let's assume they have the same approach as when I was there. This goes back to the 2017 AV Data for Safety initiative. So yes, using common data specification, use the same technology. The Federal Transit Administration spent a decade trying to figure out how to put transit on any sort of app so people knew when a train was coming. It took them 10 years. It took Google a couple months using common open data specifications and the equivalent, not kidding, of an Excel spreadsheet that could be shared. That's still how it's shared today. One of the most revolutionary technologies for reducing climate change emission pollutions has been Google Maps, because people now had a tool in their hand that made common sense. They could allow them to choose to take transit. They could allow them to take the best route. They could allow them to avoid crashes. I mean, this has had phenomenal impacts on the efficiency and effectiveness of our built transportation system. We can keep leaning on innovators to highlight the way forward. And I do think a second term of President Trump, they would take that on. But I do have the hope and belief that even if it's President Biden, they'll find a way, because they do have the understanding that there is great benefit that this technology can bring. It's just about balancing that with organized labor's demands. And that's tough. That is not an easy place to be.
Well, if there is a second President Biden administration, does organized labor try and push for a federal national driver-in bill?
I don't know how you can be successful with that. I think they have to take it more local. I mean, I don't know what's going to happen in these different states, but I don't see the facts just don't carry it through. I mean, one, being a truck driver is one of the most dangerous jobs in the country. I think it's the fourth most dangerous job in the country. So using technology that can improve safety, both for them, they should be the main ones advocating for light duty AVs to be out there, because that would improve the safety of the roadway for every road user. So when you look at this, certainly as their progression, it's hard to say that that's going to make sense. So it's tricky. I will say the Federal Railroad Administration just passed a two-man crew rule that there's no data justifying. I mean, under President Obama, the Railroad Safety Advisory Committee studied it, and they came away conclusive. There's no conclusive data this improves safety. They put out a rulemaking in, I think, 2016 that show that all the comments said there's no impact to safety. They've studied all of the major crashes that happened with railroads, and they found none of these would have been prevented from adding an additional worker there to just sit on the train. No crashes would have been prevented. Yet we just saw they passed a rule that would require a second person on a train for safety, and there was no data justification for it. And I will say, even the NTSB agreed with Federal Railroad Administration's assessment that there was no safety reason to require a second driver or a second railroad worker on a train. So it doesn't make sense, but that worries me, right? Like, that rulemaking, I don't understand why you would take that step. It has not been justified by the safety data. So I let you speculate as to why you would do that.
It's simple. It's a give me to organize labor. So they're trying this safety tactic. But I look at this and I look at some of the railroad statements. I have friends that work for the Class 1 railroads, and I get regular briefings. It's the same playbook. It's just recycled over and over again. Nobody's called them out on it. Maybe it's time somebody calls them out on it. But when did safety become a political tool? It doesn't seem like it's doing it for the benefit of humanity, benefit of society. It just seems that it became a political tool.
I don't know the answer to that. I'll say, when you do the actual cost benefit on safety, and by that I mean you figure out, does this make sense to do it at all, right? Are there the safety impacts that people are talking about? A lot of data can go into that, and you can have a lot of insights on best ways to do things, but you do have to follow the data. You do have to follow the information. one of the things that I think surprised people was when we put out our rulemaking on a safety framework for automated vehicles. It was the very end of the first term. It was a very stringent rule. I mean, what automated vehicles would have to do and prove to show safety, it's not a low bar. And the safety advocates were like, oh, we like this. I thought we were going to be mad. I thought it was supposed to be that Elaine Chao was all for a Wild West of automation. And so what we've seen is that rulemaking is very strong on safety. In the absence of moving these rulemakings creates the exact world that we were criticized for creating, but we didn't create it. We were seeking to address it, and the rulemakings have stopped. So if you look at the safety facts, and if you look at how you can improve safety for all road users using these technologies, it would say to move forward with them to make sure that there's a common set of safety standards that these companies can show safety for. I mean, everybody that puts forth a voluntary safety self-assessment, that's the most you can do without any sort of rulemaking coming forward. So those are very responsible. Any company that does that is showing responsibility. But the rulemaking would bring more of that into a formal process so that everybody understands and there's more uniformity in these approaches. And you highlight the best practices and the standards that go into proving the safety of an automated vehicle. That rulemaking should not be sidelined. That is one that should move forward that would improve safety for all road users. And again, I'm not saying we shouldn't move forward with all the other vehicle technologies or approaches to changing the infrastructure and otherwise to make roadways more safe. It's an all of the above approach when you're talking about safety. Why aren't we doing all of these things? Nothing should be stopped and waiting for other things to happen. If it improves safety, we should be advancing it.
Why have the rulemaking stopped?
Oh, I got nothing for you. I mean, we put out the advanced notice of proposed rulemaking because there's lots of questions. We said, here's how we're thinking about doing things. And I think the latest, it's been delayed 8 times, I believe, meaning informal notifications. They've said that, they've moved the timeline. I think that current is that they're analyzing comments until November or December of this year. Analyzing comments from the ANPRM that was at the end of Trump's first term, right? So that's 3.5 years. I think it's time to engage on this and to start bringing more of the conversations around the safety benefits of automated vehicles.
To me, this seems like a maneuver to slow things down. Do we see a maneuver similar to what they did with railroads around autonomous trucks and autonomous vehicles in a potential second Biden administration where they try to get some rule? It might not be driver in bill, but they try to get some rule in there since President Biden wants to be the most pro-labor president in history?
I don't know. I mean, look, the FMCSA ADS rulemaking did not move until, I take that back. They did a supplemental advanced notice proposed rulemaking, which is an unusual step. I've never seen it before. They just asked more questions in an ANPRM. They've sent the notification of the proposed rule to OMB, where it's been since December. But the fact that it didn't move at all, and then 27 organized labor unions signed on to a letter saying, you should regulate these technologies. You should regulate them in the way we want. And then the rulemaking goes to OMB. I mean, you're like, oh, what does that mean? They oppose it, and then they say, actually, you should look at moving forward the rulemakings. And then they go, and then it goes to OMB. I don't know what that means, but certainly if they're looking at trying to put forth, set the cement for a stringent rulemaking, maybe that's how they do it. I don't know. It's too much to judge before it comes out because it could come out and be something that makes a lot of sense. But if you see nothing moves, organized labor letter, it suddenly moves. I don't know. I guess I'll take my tinfoil hat off and just say, I'll read it and we'll see.
Okay, you'll do that, but I'm going to look at facts. Look at California. There's a lot of sneakiness going on. First bill to effectively ban autonomous trucks in the state passes the state assembly, the state senate. Thank you, Governor Newsom, for doing the right thing and standing on the side of the California economy, the California people, and vetoing that bill. So now what do they come back with now? Let's give city governments local control over autonomous vehicles, which you and I know would effectively ban autonomous vehicles. Could you imagine if you're in LA and you're in downtown LA and you want to go to the beach, you got to go through LA, you have to go through Beverly Hills, you have to go through West Hollywood, you have to go through Santa Monica. All different city governments could potentially all have their own laws. Does this sneakiness try and boil up to a federal level where, let's get sneaky here? We do. It's good to have local control. Meanwhile, it's an all-out effective ban. Do we see that sneakiness continue?
I don't know. I mean, look, there is a role for federalism. I mean, as we look to adopt any advanced technology, you want to make sure that people get a chance to see it, touch it, interact with it, and not have it just imposed on them. So I do agree that there is a role for federalism. But if the idea is to try and give it to every single local unit and let them conflate it, I mean, it becomes an unworkable problem. And that is a tactic that can be used to kill the technology, right? You give too many mouths to feed, and then you can't give them all information. You can't provide all the information they need. You don't have people that can go talk to every single one of them. So you have to do a lot of community outreach and engagement, but there has to be some central unit that can make the decision. If you're saying one central unit per state makes the decision, and they make sure that you work with all the state and local officials that in any area we're going to be deploying and make sure they're comfortable with it, but ultimately you have one authority, that's doable. If you're saying you have 1,000 authorities along any route, that's purposefully unworkable. We don't treat other technologies that way. It doesn't make sense, even if rhetorically you might be like, is there something there?
Could you imagine that they go down that road? What's next? Each city gets its own DMV, and then you're going to go after human drivers. Oh no, you got to pay a toll. Where does it stop?
Yeah, and I mean, think about traveling on the interstate and having to check with every locality along the interstate just to be able to complete your route.
It goes back to what you said earlier, common sense, and this bill is no common sense. Hopefully, the legislators and legislators in the California State Assembly and State Senate understand that this makes absolutely no sense. It's a gift to organized labor. Obviously, we do not have a federal framework today for autonomous vehicles or autonomous trucks weighing over 10,000 pounds. We have a patchwork of laws today. Texas has them. Florida has them. California has them to some degree. Arizona has them. Overall, where does AV policy currently stand in the United States, and how do you see that changing potentially?
So I will say, recently did a 50-state strategy look with a few different organizations where we brought in a lot of the state and local leaders to figure out what are the actual barriers and where is the actual patchwork in terms of where you can commercially deploy this technology, specifically autonomous trucks around the country. And what we found is most states are willing to engage with it. They want to learn from it. They want to see the upside. They're not looking to start out with any sort of ban. California, of course, is unique because in 2013, they passed a bill to allow autonomous trucking. They said, we want to bring this into our state, and you will pass regulations to bring it in and to make it legal. Well, had they not taken action, it would have been legal. But since they passed a law that says this will be legal upon you putting forth a regulation, now you have to have a regulation because it's banned until allowed. It's the European approach, right? So we see that perversely, California tried to do the right thing by passing a law to enable autonomous trucking, but because the follow-on regulations haven't happened and they've been years and years and years delayed, it's banned. And that was not the intent of the California legislature when they passed the rulemaking, but the executive branch entities that did not move the rulemaking forward have willed this ban into being. So it's an interesting situation where California accidentally did the wrong thing when they were trying to be supportive of the technology. It's just one of those quirks of government,
Do we ever get a national framework that will allow autonomous vehicles to go over state lines and also trucks as well? Do we ever get a national framework? There's been the LADA bill. It's a lot of hype, stop. Do we ever get anything done?
So what's interesting is the US DOT has all the authority that they need to pass the rulemakings. What Congress can give them is greater certainty that that's the direction they want them to go. We've seen the appropriators give money and specifically call out the rulemaking, saying, give us an update on where you are finishing this. We want to see this. So we have some indication that Congress is supportive, but they have not passed the rulemaking that said, you will finish this rule. So they know that DOT's working on it. DOT keeps posting publicly about it. The appropriators tag it, reporting requirements and briefing requirements to DOT saying, give us an update on where you are in passing this. So we don't have to have it, but really nothing replaces an act of Congress. We want it. It provides certainty that DOTs can't shift in the wind and change the regulations over time. So only Congress can give that certainty. And there's some things like a cap on the number of vehicles that can be exempted and otherwise that only Congress can provide. But DOT can work on the rulemakings on their own, and they should for the benefit of all of the regulated community and all of the American road users.
Certainty unlocks investment. Could you imagine when there's certainty, the amount of billions of dollars of investment capital that will flow into this industry? Because this industry, as I've said it many times, and I'll say it again, is going to become an economy, something that I call the autonomy economy. But there has, for certain investors, there has to be certainty. It's absolutely key that we have certainty. How's NHTSA currently thinking about autonomous vehicles?
So NHTSA is interesting. The former acting administrator, Ann Carlson, announced a pilot program in July of 2023, AV STEP program. And, as they talked about this, they talked about how, this would be a way for us to think through modernizing the rulemakings, learn from these pilot programs and otherwise, but they haven't done anything since then. And it's not even showing up in their rulemaking reports. So, and it used to. So I don't know if it sort of dried up when she left or if they've lost interest. But they had a big announcement in July that they were going to move forward with the pilot program around this. And we haven't seen anything since that speech in California, actually. So they also have the rulemaking that we're looking at, but it sounds like NHTSA is going to be using their information gathering authority, so the standing general order. So they get information on every single crash that involves an AV or that it was reportedly an AV was involved in. It's loose in those requirements. And they still have their defect recall and enforcement authority, and they're still engaging with industry. So they are playing a role, but it sounds like FMCSA is actually in the driver's seat, as you will, on this because they're the ones that have, autonomous trucks are being introduced into commercial operations. Certainly, we already have that on the light duty side with Waymo, Cruise, Zoox, and the others in that area. But for trucking, there's going to be a huge commercial industry there. And FMCSA has the critical rulemakings that will unlock that. And on the light duty vehicle side, we're already seeing, you can get in a autonomous vehicle today and ride around. So they don't have that barrier, is what I'm saying.
Does FMCSA just have to move? Is that what we're waiting on? Are we waiting on for them to move?
The rulemakings have to move. The exemption petition and the rulemaking.
This goes back, it's the whole theme of this podcast has been common sense. How does this not go back to common sense? Aurora, they're a publicly traded company, has filed documents that have been audited by the SEC. This is not a press release, these are SEC documents that they will be going driver route this year in the great state of Texas between Dallas and Houston. This was an SEC filings. This was an investor day. This is not a press release. This is real actionable data. Kodiak, they're not public, but they've publicly stated as well. So you have two leading companies in autonomous trucking saying we're going driver route. And then meanwhile, FMCSA is not moving. What more do you need to move?
Look, the exemption petition was submitted on March 3rd of 2023. Secretary Fox, Secretary Chow, and Secretary Buttigieg have had the guidance that I think Fox was the first to announce it, that for any of these AV-related petitions, they would act within 6 months or 180 days. So that clock closed in September. So we hit 180 days in September. It's April, right? So it's been 1 full year since the comment period closed on that petition. So we need to see some action, right? Now, they need to gather whatever information they need, but we would like to see a path forward there because otherwise you're essentially mandating driver in by not granting a safety exemption. And that's not okay.
Somebody went to sleep and decided to play Rip Van Winkle.
Look, I'm not saying it's easy, but it is important, right? It's important to the future of this industry, and it's important for roadway safety for all road users, including today's truck drivers that are out on the road today. An improved safety, this is not something that's limited to autonomous trucks. This is something for all trucks that improves safety for all trucks and the other road users, again, the people that can run into these trucks. So it's something that should move forward, and I hope to see it moving forward soon. I think that there's more activity that's happening behind the scenes. So hopefully we see something pop out in the near future.
It should move forward for the benefit of all Americans. Autonomous trucks are going to increase safety. They're going to shore up the supply chain. If we had autonomous trucks operating in the Port of LA and Long Beach during the pandemic, we wouldn't have had the backlogs we had, and we could have introduced a hybrid network, which Loadsmith is currently building. It would work. Staying on the politics front, what impact could the EPA have on the development and commercialization of both autonomous vehicles and autonomous trucks?
So it's interesting because when you look at, so if you're talking about the CAFE standards, that's NHTSA and EPA, and then you have the emission standards that came out. But when you look at either the adoption of new technology, whether it's electrification on shorter routes, or the EPA rulemaking said it envisioned hydrogen or it envisioned fuel cell technologies being how the sleeper berth size trucks, the very large trucks, will meet their emissions reduction standards of 25% by 2032. That is incredible. That's going to drive investments. So the fact that the investments have to flow towards electrification and hydrogen fuel cell technology will impact the investments that can go towards autonomous vehicle technology. But on the other side, when you're looking at the fuel efficiency standards, increasing those standards, of course, autonomous vehicle technology improves fuel efficiency, right? You've got a number of key reasons why autonomous trucks are smoother. They drive like the best professional driver, so they're not, speeding up then hitting the brakes, speeding up and hitting the brakes. There's different requirements around driving, so they can hit different congested areas at times of day when there's not congestion. And then, of course, they don't have to stop and run the heat in the middle of the winter in Michigan or the middle of the summer in Texas, running the AC using fuel in the vehicle itself. So I know at Locomation, we saw a 22% greenhouse gas reduction with the use of those systems. I've seen other systems talking about 10, 15% reductions in emissions and improvement in fuel efficiency because of these technologies. So looking at some of the NHTSA CAFE standards, that actually incentivizes the use of advanced vehicle technologies to improve fuel efficiency. But of course, the ultimate purpose of the CAFE and emissions rulemaking is to push investments towards electrification and hydrogen fuel cells. So it's a mixed bag, but certainly this technology can be used to improve the efficiency as well as the effectiveness of our national transportation system.
The current mandates for sustainability, carbon reduction aren't working. The electric Class 8 truck with a sleeper berth, 500,000. I think 540 to 525,000. Double the price of your regular Class 8. You have the weight issue, which you and I could get into. We know that. You have the range issue. You have the infrastructure issue. Why not find a middle ground and embrace renewable diesel? If you combine renewable diesel with an autonomous truck, you're going to have emissions reductions. Matt McClellan from Covenant talks about it all the time. Why not just try and get a single to start instead of trying to go for this home run that is just completely impractical? California, they're banning diesel trucks. Their economy's going to suffer. You said it earlier. If I'm Port of Savannah, come on home, baby. We're open for business. And that port's going to boom. That's what we're seeing, the big building boom in Macon, Georgia with all the inland port. I'm Texas. Come on, baby. It's going to rock and roll. But yet no common sense. Why can't we have a common sense and go for a single instead of trying to hit, I'm going to give you another baseball term, a Babe Ruth-sized grand slam?
So what's interesting is when I was at DOT, there's a 21st Century Truck Partnership Program that's DOT and Department of Energy. It's essentially the same, similar as the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation, except this is just a work group. So the focus there was on all of the vehicle technologies that could be used to reduce emissions while still providing the transportation that's needed. And they did very much have an all of the above approach. I mean, this was, and you're talking hundreds of millions of dollars of research into the basic and applied technologies that can be used for these. Now, their estimate at the time was that you wouldn't come close to anything that could work for electrification of these vehicles until 2030. Maybe 2032 before it becomes any way commercially viable or practical. So I don't know if that timeline has shifted at all, given the hundreds of millions or billions of dollars extra dumped into it. But there's going to be a lot of challenges, and there's going to have to be, I think that what's the organization that did the study that showed there needs to be $1 trillion of investments in the charging infrastructure for electric trucks. And that doesn't even touch on all of the updates that have to be made to our energy grid. So there's work that's going to have to be done. And what we may see is the passage of these technology enforcing standards, right? As they've called these rulemakings in the rulemakings themselves, and then delays and say, okay, we'll give you an extra year or two. We'll give you an extra year or two. So they put that bogey on there to force the investments to flow there. And they say, well, we'll control the cap. So we'll tell you when you're okay. I mean, that's a tough way to live if you're the regulated entity, because then you don't have the certainty. You don't know where to go. And they're requiring you to make investments in technology that are speculative, and you don't know if these investments are going to work out. So you are fundamentally betting your business on an unknown. And there may be 5 different options that you have to bet on, that you have to choose from. And the sure thing may be the one that wins, but it may not be. So we're going to have winners and losers because you have to force them to make these decisions. They can't choose all of the above, right? They have to choose a path for their limited investment dollars, their limited resources, so that they can plan out their future. I mean, it is an unenviable place to be.
It was Jim Mullen's Clean Freight Coalition that put
That's
that out
what it
there.
was.
But the free market should choose. The government should not force. There's a lot of challenges that are going to happen with AV policy, especially around the rollout of trucks. We want to have you back on again, Finch, to dive into these challenges as we get closer to the election in November, because we're going to get more data. We're going to get more stuff to go on. Maybe perhaps we have a rulemaking breakthrough, and we're going to have you back to discuss that. But for today, as we look to wrap up, what would you like our listeners and viewers to take away with them?
There is a lot of activity going on at DOT and otherwise. There's a lot of potential good. And look, organized labor has a seat at the table. They're really driving the conversation, and they have legitimate needs and legitimate concerns. They want to know how this technology is going to impact the future of their workforce. So I think there's a lot to be said for engaging directly with them, for doing the studies, doing the research, being able to tell them about the workforce of the future. You actually saw the administration put forth a workforce development plan for electrification and for batteries. I'd like to see the same for automated vehicles, led by the government, where companies can submit information, say, these are the sort of jobs we're going to create. These are the sort of jobs our customers are looking to create with this technology. Here's the skills they need. The government aggregates it together, and then we can create a work plan and a roadmap. That's how you address the needs of organized labor, not by banning the technology, but by showing them the path forward and giving them tools to educate and to prepare for these, so that the truck driver of tomorrow can choose a job that's better for them, with a higher quality of life, a better paycheck, more consistent working hours, and that gets them home to their families every day. They can choose the future they want, not the past that we've been stuck with for the decades behind us. There's a better path forward using this technology, and if we can advance it proactively, embracing the technology, we could bring that future to Americans.
There is a better path forward. Let's sit down, old-fashioned DC politics. Let's sit across from each other and have a conversation. Let's not yell at each other. Let's just have a conversation and hash out our differences. If you want to have a cigar during that conversation, have a cigar. We can even do it in the cloakroom if you want, or if you want to be Ulysses S. Grant and have a whiskey and sit at the chair, you can do that too. But let's have a meaningful conversation. He did that at the Willard Hotel. I don't know if you can do that today, because we have a thing called the Secret Service and security. The future is bright. The future is autonomous. The future is common sense policy for autonomous vehicles and autonomous trucks. Finch, thank you so much for coming on the road to autonomy today.
Thanks for having me on.
If you've enjoyed listening, please kindly rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Want to get in touch? Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at Road to Autonomy, or email podcast@roadtoautonomy.com. The Road to Autonomy podcast is produced by the Road to Autonomy LLC. The views and opinions expressed on the Road to Autonomy podcast do not necessarily reflect those views of the Road to Autonomy, its subsidiaries, its shareholders, directors, investors, or partners. The content discussed on this podcast is for informational purposes only. It should not be taken as legal, investment, tax, or business advice. Nothing is a recommendation that you purchase, sell, or hold any security or other investment, or that you pursue any investment style or strategy. The content of this podcast is presented on an as-is basis with no warranties, express or implied, of any kind. Financial mentions about companies in the Road to Autonomy Index and discussions about the Road to Autonomy Indexes are for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon when making any investment decision. Furthermore, an inclusion of security within the Road to Autonomy Index is not a recommendation by the Road to Autonomy Indices LLC to buy, sell, or hold that such security, nor is it considered to be investment advice.